Ignacio Martín-Baró is a Jesuit priest, a professor of psychology, the chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Central America in San Salvador, the editor of the Revista de Psicología de El Salvador, formerly known as the Boletín. He's also vice president of the Inter-American Psychological Society. And as if that didn't give him enough to do, he is also the director of the University Institute of Public Opinion. We owe it to his genius to have developed a process for expression in a country where speech is often penalized by death. So, I would like to turn the floor over to Ignacio Martín-Baró.
I think it's important to historize, to put into history the facts of political terrorism in our Latin American countries, in Central America, and more concretely in El Salvador. I think that in order to understand what political terrorism means right now for the Salvadorans, we have to look at three important dimensions, which very often confuse the images that we have about what political terrorism is. The first dimension is political terrorism being conducted by small groups and even by a bunch of individuals, isolated individuals or representative of very minoritarian groups versus state terrorism. I think this is the first dimension to be considered. A second dimension is to consider political terrorism as a series of extraordinary events versus political terrorism as ordinary, daily life events. And the third dimension that I think is important to understand political terrorism in El Salvador is to look either at individual consequences of that terrorism, of those actions, versus seeing at collective consequences of that terrorism. Let me very quickly go over these three dimensions in the concrete situation of El Salvador. The first dimension is to consider political terrorism either conducted by small groups or state terrorism. Certainly in El Salvador, we have political terrorism conducted by small groups. There are death squads, those groups that operate, I think, on the fringes of the social system. And I don't think that some of the death squads can be directly linked to any significant social force in the sense of saying this death squad is a part of the National Guard or is a part of the armed forces or is something that has been arranged by the government. There are some death squads that operate under the direction of very little groups of rich people, of landowners, and so on. There is also the what I would call terrorism by insurgent forces, by the FNLA, and it's important to acknowledge that. There are acts of terrorism conducted by the revolutionary groups. For instance, very recently, 8 mayors of small towns have been killed. And I consider these acts of terrorism. Afterwards, about more than 30 mayors of different towns have been forced by the FMLN threats to resign. So I would say these are acts of terrorism conducted by either small groups or by the FMLN, which is neither a large group in that sense. But versus or against this kind of terrorism, the most common form of terrorism that we have to suffer in El Salvador is state terrorism. That kind of way of terrorizing the whole population by systematic actions conducted by forces of the state, by the military, by security forces, and if not directly ordained by the government, certainly accepted by the government and covered up by the government. And let me add that insofar as this state terrorism is conducted by the armed forces, the security forces, and covered up by the government, the United States government is also involved in that kind and responsible for this kind of terrorism. So it's important whenever we think of terrorism against the image that very often comes to the mass media in terms of an act, a crazy act conducted by small groups of Palestinian or Libyans or I don't know who, to see that this is a kind of a systematic state terrorism. The second dimension is to contrast or to see whether terrorism, political terrorism, consists of extraordinary events or rather of ordinary events. Certainly there are acts of terrorism which happen very seldom and which can be considered extraordinary events. For instance, I can mention a very recent event, not that very recent, but a recent event that took place last September, the 21st. An event which, in which a military patrol killed 10 peasants in San Sebastián, the department of San Vicente, in the central part of El Salvador. That event was certainly not a common event. It was an extraordinary event by the fact that it happened and by the consequences in terms of the successive denials of the armed forces. Now, I think that's an extraordinary event that has not been taking place very often, that the military go take these 10 peasants out of their houses and in cold blood kill them after torturing some of them. But I think that even accepting that we have this still, and now these kind of extraordinary events are on the rising again, the most important political terrorism that takes place in El Salvador, and that usually does not make the news, does not appear as something that can be interesting for the readers or for the watchers of TV, is what I would call day by day, daily terrorism. Ordinary events. And by that I mean systematic pressure applied upon the whole population. Systematic harassment of those who think differently, of those organizations, for instance, humanitarian organizations that try to help the victims of the war. The systematic prohibition of certain things that the government doesn't like. The systematic labeling through mass media of any kind of opposition as subversive, terrorist, which somehow triggers